Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. This is Cameron Bertuzzi, and by this I mean me. I am Cameron Bertuzzi. You're watching Capturing Christianity. This is a ministry aimed at exposing the intellectual side of Christian belief, and today we're doing something a little bit different. We're talking about reincarnation. This is actually the first time we've talked about this subject, so this is a debate. Well, we're sort of pitching it as a debate. It's more of a dialogue. We do have some opening statements we're going to do, but let me go ahead and just introduce my guest really quickly, and then we'll just jump right in. I don't waste a whole lot of time at the beginning of these videos. So Seth Hart, he's right below me. He is a PhD candidate. Actually, you know what? You can find more about these guys in the description of this video. To me, like when I watch some of these debate videos, and I'm already like wasting time by talking about this, but when I watch some of these debate videos, they spend like 10 or 20 minutes just on like opening introductions. I'm like, get to the meat, like get to the debate. That's all I want. And so if you want to learn more about my guests, look in the description. We've actually got bios and stuff, and you can go find out Arjuna. This is his first time on the channel. He's that way. And I actually saw him on his channel first, and he was in a debate on a modern day debate, but I think you may have posted that on your channel, or was it on his? Do you actually like cross? Okay, you posted it on yours. Yeah, anyway, so I saw
a modern day debate upload to the channel.
So I saw Arjuna first on in this debate, and I just fell in love is a little bit too strong, but it was close to that. Like I really like, he's very philosophically minded, and it was just it was really enjoyable to listen to him present his case. And so I just wanted to have a debate or a dialogue on reincarnation because there's actually some really interesting evidence in support of it. And Seth obviously is a Christian, and myself, we disagree with the evidence. We don't think that it actually supports what Arjuna is going to be arguing for today. But on that note, Arjuna is going to be giving a positive case for reincarnation. So why don't I just go ahead and turn it over to you, Arjuna. If you want, you can do a little introduction for yourself, let people know where they can go to find out more about your work. But then after that, just go directly into your opening statement that you've got prepared.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Arjuna. I live in New Zealand. You can find out more about me on my YouTube channel, where I host debates and try to bring the Eastern theological, the Hare Krishna perspective to the dialogue. So mostly philosophy of religion is philosophy of Christianity. I'm a Hare Krishna, which is Vaishnavism, comes from India, and I try to bring that into the dialogue. So with that, I'll get right into my opening statement. I had some tech issues this morning, so I didn't get to go over my notes, but I got them ready last night. So first of all, what we're talking about here is children who spontaneously report memories of past lives. These have been compiled extensively with using rigorous modern standards of evidence by researchers such as Dr. Ian Stevenson and Dr. Jim Tucker, as well as some other associates. The researchers did not like to do hypnotherapy cases because they had a low hit rate. Hypnotherapy can produce false memories where somebody mixes information they heard earlier but forgot about with some imagination and produces false memories. There is an odd case which provides compelling evidence for reincarnation that does come from hypnotherapy. But the researchers particularly like to focus on children who spontaneously report memories of past lives. And there's a few reasons for that. One is it's pretty easy with children to rule out that they heard the information at an earlier stage and forgotten about it. If someone's 3 years old, you can have a pretty good idea what they have and haven't heard about already. So I'm talking here today about evidence and not proof. So here's a quote on that subject from Jim Tucker in his book, Return to Life, or maybe his other book. These cases are not about proof, they're about evidence. Since this work has taken place in the messy real world rather than a tightly controlled laboratory, proof is not possible. This is often the case in science and medicine. For example, many medications are judged to be helpful because evidence indicates they work, even though they may not be absolutely proven to do so. So the nature of the evidence, there's three main aspects to the evidence. We have veridical memories. So this means the children give statements about this past life that they're speaking of, which later turn out to be accurate to a particular deceased individual. Another aspect is personality traits, such as emotions, behaviors, and phobias, which also turn out to match the same deceased individual. The vocab we'll use is the previous personality for the deceased individual who matches. And then birthmarks or birth defects, which also match illnesses or wounds on the body of the deceased individual. This is consistent with an idea we have in Vedic thought of impressions in the mind being able to have an imprint on the body. So, of course, in holistic health, you have this idea that what's going on in your mind can affect your body. And stigmata, there's meditation affecting the body. So, and also the samskaras, the deep ones, can carry over from one life to the next. So an interesting point is that most of the children who report memories of past lives, they suffered some kind of traumatic death, or they had some unresolved things interpersonally, like they had children they left behind, young children, or something of that sort. So with that, I'll get into an example case. So this is the case of Kumkum Verma, who at age 3 began saying she had lived in a city which happened to be 25 miles away. She described the name of the town where she had lived, Darbhanga, and gave various details about the life of a woman in this town, which later turned out to be accurate. Kumkum's grandma recorded 18 statements made by Kumkum about the previous personality, such as the name of her son, the fact that he worked with a hammer. At this, she was about 3 at the time, so she would have lacked the vocabulary to explain that he was a blacksmith. Her grandson's name, the town where her father had lived, and personal details such as having an iron safe at home, a sword hanging near the cot where she slept, and a pet snake to which she fed milk. So we're not talking about random details like I was someone who died in New York, in an alleyway where, that could be true of literally thousands of people. We're talking about very specific details. There was one case of a boy who was able to identify where some gold coins had been hidden by the previous personality. No one knew where these coins were until the boy gave the location. So possible alternative explanations. We have fraud, imagination, suggestibility, gullibility, demons, demons planted the memories there. That's a fun one because then it leaves us wide open to last Thursdayism, because if demons can plant memories in these children, maybe they can plant all my memories of everything prior to last Thursday. I think fraud we can discount because the strong cases presented by the thorough researchers, of those cases, I've not seen anyone where fraud was proven. And it is common in parapsychology stuff for people to write a book, get some attention, make a bit of money, and it later be found out that there was some fraud involved. But I think the absence of any fraud being uncovered, especially when skeptics are diligently trying to uncover this, suggests that fraud's not really involved, at least in the prominent cases. And then imagination and gullibility we can rule out because the accuracy of the information, it's not something you can attribute just to coincidence. So the researchers have 2,500 cases coded into a database, which allows them to track patterns in the data. And with this, we can see patterns in the data which we would not expect were other explanations responsible. We'd have to chalk these down to coincidence, which I think goes beyond being reasonable. So, for example, 62% of the previous personalities were male. There's a number of the cases where the previous personality was a different gender. That does go on. So the question is, why is it more males than females? So when they analyzed the data, they found that 30% of the previous lives, the cause of death, in the cases where the cause of death was known, 30% of them, it was a natural death. And of these, 50% are male. It's the cases where it's an unnatural death, where it's 70% male. 70% involve an unnatural death, and of these, 73% are male. And the statistics for the population in America over a 5-year period was found to be 72% male for unnatural deaths. So this matches perfectly what we would expect if it was reincarnation that was responsible for this. And another pattern in the data is time between lives is faster in regions with higher birth rates. So, countries like, well, I guess not China with their one-child policy, but India and other countries like that where they have more children, higher birth rates, people are reincarnating faster, it would seem, which would make sense because there's more opportunities to take birth. In America, the time between lives is often longer. So other important features of the data that make it compelling. The children do not score higher on measures of disassociation and suggestibility. So if imagination were responsible, we would expect them to score higher on things like that. They do seem to show mild symptoms of PTSD, and Dr. Jim Tucker reported, he's a child psychologist, so he would know that often some of the children seem to show what we would call traumatic play. So when a child has gone through something traumatic, they'll often act out and play the traumatic event. James Leiniger, a boy who remembered the life of an aircraft fighter pilot who died in World War II, would constantly crash his toy planes into the coffee table, which broke off all the propellers from his toy planes and left the coffee table dented, covered in scratches. And this is consistent with what we would expect if these children were traumatized from a past life and some remnants of that carried over into the past life. The children rarely show signs of mental illness. They're just ordinary kids. They might score slightly higher on some intelligence scores. They often have slightly bigger vocabularies. The strength of the K-score doesn't correlate with the parents' initial attitude. So if it were that the parents were falsely attributing more accurate statements to the children just because they wanted it to be true, we would expect to see that when the parents are positive about the idea that the child is reincarnated, that would correlate with a higher strength of case score. So a strength of case score means the number of accurate statements, correlation of birthmarks, various other factors that are used to determine the strength of the case. And strength of case just means it provides stronger evidence. And we don't see a correlation there with the initial attitude of the parents. The cases with written reports are stronger than the ones without. So if it was false attribution to these children of more accurate statements than they had actually made, then why would the ones with written records be stronger? Because a written record is an opportunity to actually get the details right rather than make things up. Whereas the idea that their memories are being falsely attributed to the children kind of relies on a foggy memory of what the children actually said. The idea is that the children make some vague statements of having been someone before, and someone's made who kind of matches that past life, and then the families exchange information. The children hear some of that information, and the families falsely attribute some of that information to the child, when in fact they had just heard it through ordinary means. The cases do not grow stronger over time, so if this false attribution were going on, we would expect the cases to go stronger over time as the children become more intelligent and gain more information about the previous life. But this is not what happens. If they re-examined 15 cases that had been studied before, and they found roughly the same strength of case score. So there wasn't an increase in the amount of information accredited to the child over time. The children have an easier time recognizing people and places from old photos, which would be consistent with them having lived at the time. So if you show them a more recent photo when things have changed, they don't recognize it as well. And some of the cases contain inaccuracies which make the cases stronger. For example, a boy called Ekaphon recalled the life of a young man who died in a hunting accident. He was sure that a man called Fon was the killer. The other people in the village had a different story of who the killer was. He was so sure that this man called Fon was the killer that as a toddler he tried to strangle him. He could not have got this idea from the villagers, because this was not the opinion that the villagers had. This was coming from his own convictions. And in the case of Ryan, who's an American case, a boy who remembers the life as some Hollywood personality, we see him denying remembering a house he was told belonged to the previous personality. This denial was even filmed as part of a TV segment. If they were trying to get false information, they would have just gone along with it and pretended he remembered it. But later, the researchers found they had misidentified the previous personality, and when Ryan was presented with photos from the previous life, he was able to recognize and identify some. If it was short, surely he would have lied about not recognizing the house. And finally, of note is the fact that children cannot have had access to that information, and the fact that these children rarely show any paranormal abilities. If they're getting information through some kind of ESP, why don't they display ESP for other things? So Ryan is an interesting case for showing that they couldn't have got the information from other means, because it took extensive research to track down the previous personality. Where did I put my notes on that? So they here it is. Yeah, they hired an archival footage consultant. So Jim Tucker couldn't identify it. They did a TV show on it, and the TV researchers couldn't identify it. They hired an archival footage consultant. So Ryan had described the life of a Hollywood personality and found a photo and said, "That's me." And this was an unnamed extra in a movie. So nobody could figure out who it was. They just had a photo. And he made something like 40 or 50 statements which turned out to be accurate about this person. And there's no way he could have known this just from a photo. And they weren't seeing if his statements were true of anybody. They were seeing if his statements were true of the person in the photo, which makes the odds pretty small if that happened by coincidence. So the few researchers figured out. Finally, they hired a specialist, an archival footage consultant. She sent the photo to other researchers. None of them could identify it. Finally, she went to the largest film library in the world, or one of the largest, and got everything she could from the film. And then she found a single photo that had a name of the person, and then they got an identification. So there's no way Ryan or his mother could have done that amount of research and figured out who it was, and then just made up the story. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I haven't got a clock going.
You've got about a little less than 2 minutes.
All right. So there's controlled recognition cases. And in one case, a girl in controlled conditions was observed recognizing several people from the previous life and indicating that she knew the relationship that the previous personality had with each person. So I'm probably going to pronounce the name wrong. Gana Tilika, my text-to-speech app's been pronouncing it for me, so that's where I'm getting my pronunciation, was able to identify the relationship the boy had with each individual. She said, she's my teleweekly mother, for example, including both parents, his brother, and 2 sisters. She also gave details about them that were not obvious from the appearance, saying that she went to school by train with one sister and that the other lived in a house below the families. She said she remembered going there to sew clothes, which the boy had done. When presented with a man who had moved to Talawika after the boy had died, Gianna Tilika said she did not know him. When the brother of the previous personality went in, she was asked if she knew him. She said angrily no. She only admitted to knowing him when the researchers said she could tell just her mother. So this is interesting that the like I was saying before, the personality traits, the emotions match. There was one boy, when asked by the brother of the previous personality to prove he was the previous personality, told him he had given him a Chiki 16, a type of pistol not common in Lebanon. Is that time?
Oh, we're very close. I just pulled up this scene so that you could kind of get the hint that it's almost time.
He had cut the widow of the previous personality's leg. The widow confirmed that he had cut her on the leg during an argument, and she had a scar to show for it. So, yeah, and there's one case of a boy speaking English when he grew up in an Arabic-speaking culture, and he spoke very little Arabic and had perfect English, which is very bizarre. Yeah, I've actually got to the end of my notes, so I raced through and got to the end.
Wow. Perfect. Great. Okay, so we're about to turn it over to Seth, but before we do that, some people in the live chat were saying that, Arjuna, your audio was only coming through the left side. So maybe go through like your OBS settings, see if there's anything going on there, because they can hear Seth in their right ears. So hopefully it's not on my end. Arjuna, just look through your settings, because I know that you were having some technical issues before. But while you're looking at that, we'll go ahead and bring Seth in. Seth, it's so good to see you again.
It's great to see you.
I know. Last time we saw each other, we were playing Super Smash Brothers together.
Yeah, for 2-3 hours, late into the night. It was a lot of fun.
It was so much fun. Okay, putting that aside, let's get into your
audio setup because of my tech issues. So I don't know if I can control that. I don't know if you have a way you can mono it.
No, I can't on my end. My software doesn't have that ability. People are saying that it's not that big of a deal. I mean, they can still hear you. So if you can't fix it, don't worry about it, because we're live. So we'll just keep going. So Seth, whenever you're ready, just start, and I'll start my timer.
Yeah. Is my screen up?
It is now.
Gotcha. All right. So yeah, I just want to go tail off of what Arjuna was saying and ask, is there good evidence for reincarnation? And just like he said, with Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, we're only focusing on children's memories. That is the primary evidence that's going to be under consideration. He himself has said, Ian Stevenson has said, this is the real only good evidence we have. So the entire case rises and falls on this particular thing. Now, I have a lot here, and I'm not going to touch everything, but I wanted to give a slide for people who want to go back and watch it and read through it. I'm just going to try and hit the highlights as much as I can. So there's 2 points to the case. The first one is I don't believe the evidence is conclusive in favor of that this is a real phenomenon that needs explanation. For the first case, there's not a real proper method. So Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, what they'll do is they'll go in and they'll say, okay, here's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of things that don't match up. The children had a lot of false statements, but here's the things that matched up. Well, when do we know we have a hit? There's always going to be two things that people overlap, but they never give us a sort of positive measure, a confirmation measure. They say, yes, this is a positive hit of reincarnation. Nor is it falsifiable, because there's always going to be differences. So so immediately when we're asking the question, because the question isn't whether or not reincarnation is true, the question is whether or not it has strong evidence. But without that method, how do we know? And they've never sufficiently addressed the question. But let's look at the methodology itself. And there's some issues with it. First off, Ian Stevenson said he has no fear of using leading questions. Now that's bad, and he has been highly criticized for that. Number two, he shows a strong tendency towards confirmation bias. Now, there was a case of a man named Ryle in the UK, I believe, and Arjuna said none of the cases have been proven fraud. Well, this one has been. Ian Stevenson promoted this case. It's a man, an adult man actually, who claimed to remember a past life. Stevenson wrote an introduction for his book. It was later found out to be a fraud, and for a decade afterward, Stevenson still defended the case. Even though it had been shown that it was fraud. Stevenson actually lists 7 cases where he talks about have been shown to be frauds, and also admits that parents will often provoke their children to give confirmatory evidence, which he doesn't try to dissuade necessarily. He says he doesn't think that this sort of diminishes the evidence, which should immediately give us some suspicion and some pause. Another thing on the matching birthmarks, excuse me for my dyslexia for a moment, the matching birthmarks. They're very limited. Around 41 cases have these. And he says there's close correspondence between the past wounds and the modern birthmarks. Well, what does that mean? He never defines it. And I could find at least 2 cases where he says, well, the birthmark actually moved since the child was born. So that immediately gives us pause. The birthmark has moved. So, I can keep going, but I'm going to continue to rush through this. I'll give you just this quotation from someone who did an extensive study. It's a Hindu philosopher named C.T.K. Chan, obviously someone who believes in reincarnation. He says, a reincarnation fantasy in a small Asian child starts typically in play or a game-like situation and is later exaggerated by credulous parents. There's 1 billion people in India. If there's a 1 in a million chance that these kids will get right information, that means you're going to get thousands of cases where kids get right information. The parents will exaggerate this. But now let's talk about the witnesses themselves. Stevenson admits that excited townsfolk will often ask leading questions, which makes it, in his own words, impossible for the children to get wrong answers. Now, there was a way of preventing that, which is get to the children before the 2 families meet, before the deceased personality and the new child meet. Well, the problem is that virtually never happens. This massively reduces the evidential value because then the 2 families can corroborate their testimonies. And even in the cases where they say they haven't, Stevenson has found that they often will lie or that they'll share a mutual contact. And so this is a quote from him on pre-contact cases. I do not think I could have been more eager to find such cases or more disappointed that we have thus far found so few. So Arjuna mentions thousands of cases. Well, they're from 2 different counts, one from a guy named Roll, another from a man named Ransom, who's actually Stevenson's assistant. Only 7 in the first case, or 11, according to Ransom, of these cases were the child statements recorded prior to verification by the other family. And of those, Ransom claimed 7 were seriously flawed. So at most, we have 7 statements, according to Roll, 7 statements from children that really can count towards what we call strong evidence. That's not a lot. Even though he says there's thousands, they massively have been reduced when you look at the cases case by case. Another problem is the time between the event and the research. The average gap between the child's statement and the researcher's arrival is 3 to 5 years. John Hick, the philosopher and believer in reincarnation, has denounced these studies because he doesn't think they're raw enough. He doesn't think that these provide good evidential value. Stevenson himself, when it comes to recording data, says he doesn't use tape recorders very often. It's to reduce irrelevancy, he says. So he doesn't take people's notes down word for word. He has to rely on basically cliff notes. And another problem has been he virtually always has to rely on interpreters. And in at least 2 cases, 2 of these translators have found out to be tabloid figures. One who's pronounced her sole mission was to promote the truth of reincarnation to Western world. And he admits that these interpreters often mistranslate. Another problem has been there's been zero investigation of the playmates. Could these children have gotten information from their playmates? Stevenson never investigates this. It's a huge evidential gap. And Ransom, his assistant, has noted this. Moving quickly through it, almost all cases are within contact distance. It's usually within the same family or town. And to quote him, almost always members of the same immediate or extended family. That's very suspicious. Why are people reincarnating to the same family? It's nearly as if people are missing lost relatives and interpreting their children as the reincarnation of lost relatives. Now, I won't go through. There's been clashes between researchers. Different researchers using the same methods will often get very different results, which might reveal a methodological issue. Another thing that Arjuna mentioned is past wounds carry over as birthmarks. Why is it? Stevenson can never explain why it is it's only wounds. Why isn't it sex or physical looks? It only ever appears to be these birthmarks, these wounds. Next is there's just a lack of explanatory scope with the reincarnation hypothesis. Stevenson says there's at least 10 cases where the two lives overlapped. The former personality did not die until after the latter was born, meaning they lived at the same time. So it cannot be the case that this is a case of reincarnation. And this includes some of Stevenson's best cases. So he actually introduces, so Arjuna made fun of the spirit possession hypothesis, but Stevenson himself believes it in these cases. He believes that there is spiritual possession going on in these cases. And it doesn't occur to him, why not just take the simpler explanation and say that spiritual possession is the case for all of them? So, and there's also some unusual common characteristics for virtually all these cases. Nearly all of them are from cultures that already affirm reincarnation. And of the ones that are the Western cases, they're nearly always evidentially inferior to the ones from countries and cultures that believe in reincarnation. Stevenson says he has no satisfactory explanation for this. And the children, we talked about the traits of the children. There are some, so Arjuna briefly mentioned, they are generally smarter and they have better memories than their peers. There's also greater reports of behavioral issues. And some other weird characteristics that reincarnation doesn't explain is there's a greater number of females having been males in the previous life when they come from patriarchal cultures. And there's an unusually high number or complaint about being from a wealthier family in a past life. All of this is explained better by a more mundane explanation than reincarnation. So Stevenson admits every single case he has flaws. That's something he himself admits in his works. And to quote him, I do not think any single case offers compelling evidence for reincarnation. He thinks perhaps the cumulative case of all these flawed cases can together build a case. A similar logic could be used for Bigfoot or UFOs, a bunch of flawed witnesses. But of course, we're not going to touch on that. I just wanted to point out that it's a similar logic being used there. And so just to give you an idea, in 1981, an article by Dr. David Barker attempted to replicate Stevenson's results in 59 cases. Every single one failed. Now, just to end this first section, Champ Ramsden, he was a lawyer and former assistant to Ian Stevenson, who was a believer and was his assistant until 1970. This was his experience. He says, my experience as a research assistant was an interesting but painful one. Eventually, I became disillusioned, mostly because of the zealous attitude of the researchers, the defensive attitude toward outside skepticism, and the weakness of the evidence. The more thoroughly I studied an alleged paranormal event, the less likely the paranormal explanation seemed right. That's far too brief of an explanation, but we have to move on because there's a second part, which is, let's say he's right. Let's say this is a phenomenon. Despite all the flaws, Stevenson and Tucker are on to something. Well, I don't think it warrants the conclusion of reincarnation. All that needs to be explained is shared memories, not a shared soul. There's a logical jump here from having the same memory to having the same identity. Thus, reincarnation is, by its very nature, a more complex hypothesis. You're explaining more than you need to, which is just the shared memories. So here's some simpler alternatives. Number one, and before I get into these, I'm not saying I believe any of these. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm simply saying that once we allow one paranormal explanation in, we should allow all of them and see which one does better. The first one I've mentioned in an earlier video on Cam's channel is morphic resonance. It's by Rupert Sheldrake. It's got a greater explanatory scope. Sheldrake didn't come up with this idea. He's a Cambridge biologist, Cambridge-educated biologist. He didn't come up with this idea to explain these events. He came up with it to explain crystallization, development, migration, apparent changes in the fundamental constants of the universe. Just so happens that I found in one interview, he says, yes, it also explains these instances where Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker are talking about in a way that doesn't invoke reincarnation. Explains birthmark correlations too, in a way better than positing some soulish impression that passes between lives. It also explains why most cases happen within the same family. There's a genetic similarity. Now you might be wondering, what is morphic resonance? And I won't be able to give a much of a description. I'd suggest going back to that earlier video, but basically it's this idea that form retains memory. It's based off the Bergsonian philosophy. He's entrenched within some philosophy there, but overall, that's all I'll be able to really talk about. But basically, it is the idea that memories can pass between two structures of similar forms. They form a morphic field, is how he would phrase it. Number 2 is the Akashic field and retrocognition. This is from Ervin Laszlo, who's a philosopher of science, 4 honorary doctorates, nominated for a Nobel Prize, extremely intelligent man. And to quote him, "We do not disappear from the world without a trace. All that we experience becomes part of a collective memory bank of humankind, to be read out again and again. We can live on in the brain and consciousness of people today and in all future generations." And what he means by that is he believes that the quantum vacuum is a place where information is stored. So everything you ever do or think or experience is stored in the quantum vacuum and can be picked up again by later generations. Now, it also has greater explanatory scope within science. He also didn't come up with this to explain children who remember past lives. He used it to explain cosmic fine-tuning, parent directions in evolution, non-locality and quantum entanglement, and even psychic phenomenon. It's only in one page of his book that he says, yes, this also explains Stevenson's results. Notre Dame psychologist Morton Kelsey has said, the idea of participation in a spiritual or psychoid realm is a simpler theory than reincarnation. So it's simpler and it has greater explanatory scope. We talked about spirit possession, and there's been quite a few people who've talked about this, including Stevenson himself, like I said. So just to quote, cite one quote, "In reference to demonic counterfeit hypothesis, we can safely say that for many past life visions, it is most solidly verified hypothesis of all." And not only that, it has a greater explanatory scope. It explains the cases even Stevenson had to appeal for this. Why certain children knew where their bodies were after death. That's something that you wouldn't think a dead person who had died would know, where their body was or where it was moved to. But the children, on occasion, will remember where the body was taken to and why they eventually forgot their memories. The spirit would have left them. Another one is I call this the new stone tape memory, or sort of memory bundles. It's a couple researchers who talk about this. Well, they think that, in short, what survives is a recording of what a dying person happens to think of. So it is simpler. It's just the memories that stay behind. It doesn't require a whole soul, but just the memories. It has a greater explanatory scope because it explains why the memories are partial. So it can explain why the children often get things wrong as well. It explains why so many are connected to a geographic region and why so many of the parents pass through the area, because he thinks they're tied to geographic areas. It explains why the most recent memories of the deceased are often remembered, and explains post-conception reincarnations, like the 10 examples I mentioned earlier. And finally, there's one that I came up with. This is like a mental ocean idea. So what if consciousness is like an ocean, right? And my individual consciousness is like a cup that's taken out, and when I die, it's poured back in. Well, on occasion, they'll overlap. I'll take a cup out of the water, and some of the water will have been water that was from a previous personality. Well, that doesn't mean that they're the same cup of water. It just means that there's partial overlap. Some of my atoms in my body might have once been shared by dinosaurs, for instance. That doesn't make me a reincarnation of a dinosaur. Why can't something very similar happen on a conscious level? This also explains why the memories are partial.
That's time, Seth.
All right. So I'll go ahead and end at this. No matter how you look at it, reincarnation gets the short end of the evidential stick. And I'll go ahead and point that. That's the percentages that I point to. So let's give it 50% for the first one, that the evidence warrants the phenomenon. Well, given that I've given 5 explanations, that's 20%. Put those together. The most you can get is 10%. So does this constitute good evidence? I don't think so.
All right. So at this point, we're going to turn it to, we're going to transition into just open dialogue. And then after that, if we have time, we'll do some Q&A. But right now, we're just going to do some open dialogue. Where would you guys like to start? I know where I would like to start. Would you like to hear?
Sure.
Oh, now your mic is muted still, Arjuna. No
Okay.
worries.
Yep.
Yeah. So where I'd like to start, because Arjuna, I've heard you say this before, and it's like if you entertain the demonic possession hypothesis, then you're going to open yourself up to this last Thursdayism type of objection. So would you mind spelling out like explicitly how that reasoning works for me? Because I don't see how that like follows.
Well, I mean, Seth formulated it a little bit better, so it's not susceptible in the same way. But when I was debating G-Man and he put it forward, and when you're on Facebook and you debate Christians, usually they'll say the demons could have planted the memories there. It's like, okay, so demons can go around planting memories, can't they? So maybe demons planted everybody's memory of the resurrection of Jesus or something like that. You kind of need to be able to rely on the veracity of memory if you want to have any kind of a worldview. But with the possession that I think Gary Habermas put forward, I think he was saying demons were possessing, but if you're going to say it's demons possessing, then it's a similar problem, right? You've got some entity coming along and giving the appearance of there being memories to the child of reincarnation and creating the appearance of evidence for reincarnation for us, which is like, okay, so demons are trying to deceive us. What else might they be deceiving us about? And then the other way you could have possession is that the previous personality, the soul of this previous personality, has attached itself to the body. So the only way this differs from reincarnation is that you've got somebody fighting for a body with someone else, or two people sharing a body. A lot of the possession cases, it seems like there was one case where a boy called Jaspir Singh, he seemed to die at age 2 or 3, and they didn't bury his body because it was late at night. They went to bury him the next day, and they found him coming to life. And when he came back to life, he had a completely different personality. So in New Age circles, would be called a walk-in. So a crawl-in is where you're a baby and you go through all the stages and you enter life that way. A walk-in is someone who enters a body sometime after birth. So this would be one personality leaving and another getting in. And on the idea that the body is like a machine, the idea we have in Christian consciousness, it's just a machine that you occupy for a time and then you move on. There's nothing wrong with the idea that somebody could hop out of a body and someone else hop in. Those were just a few points on possession. Seth, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, it just seems like, well, if you already believe this, fair enough. But whenever we're not going to import religious context in. We're going to look at the evidence itself, right? And one hypothesis that can explain the data is always preferable to two hypotheses to explain the data. Occam's razor, right? So if one explains it and explains more of the data, then you don't need to reintroduce reincarnation. So again, the question isn't whether or not reincarnation is true. Reincarnation could be true. But the question is what does the scientific data support? Is this strong evidence? And just purely from Occam's razor, it seems like a spirit possession or spirit takeover, of another person, which then later leaves. Because remember, it's not as if the children only have this for a temporary amount of time. Normally, they virtually always forget it. That seems to be a much simpler hypothesis.
So the reason why the children forget their memories around the same age that childhood, I think they call it childhood amnesia, takes place. So, for example, if a child has a family friend who's around until they're age 3 or 4, and that person leaves, maybe just up until 2 or 3, then when the child's 6, they usually won't remember this person, and these memories fade at the same time. And if it was that the memories of the past life lasted longer than childhood memories, then we'd have to ask, why are older memories lasting longer than more recent memories? There are cases where people into adulthood can remember the past lives, and these are cases where there's been a lot of connection or discussion about it, where the person's been connected to things or people from the past life, so they have reminders of these things.
Yeah, none of that seems to rule out the case that the spirit is impacting them. And again, I'm not saying I believe this. I'm just saying it's a simpler hypothesis. What if the person's previous personality, what if not the person's soul has latched on parasitically to someone? Again, this is something Stevenson himself entertains in these sort of outlier cases. And I just don't see any way of saying, well, reincarnation fits the data better than this, because this one is explanatorily superior in the fact that it explains a larger swath of the data.
Arjuna, how closely do you align with Stevenson? Because it's not like, Seth, not to say anything bad about you, but you're debating Arjuna, not Stevenson. I want to see how closely Arjuna is aligned with Stevenson. Are you like everything he says you're in line with, or where are you at?
I mean, I think that he's thorough with how he handles the data. I didn't actually read the quotes from his critics. Like the Janma has a really positive review of him where they said, in regard to reincarnation, he has painstakingly and unemotionally collected a detailed series of cases in which the evidence is difficult to explain on any other grounds. So there's many skeptics who say positive things about his method. With regard to the Champ Ransom criticisms, those criticisms were made of a number of cases, but the stronger cases, which Ian Stevenson presents as these and more the compelling cases, Champ Ransom didn't mention those ones, and those ones didn't contain the methodological flaws which Champ Ransom was complaining about. This was written about by the philosopher Robert Almeida, who wrote a response to Champ Ransom and Paul Edwards. So I think he has good methods and he collects the data well. Obviously, I've got a completely different worldview from him. Him and Jim Tucker, they don't have a particular worldview they're trying to plug everything into. They're just looking at the data and saying, well, this is what it seems to be saying. Back on the point of a simpler explanation, just because possession explains some of the cases, or what I'm calling a Crowlin explains some of the cases, again, I don't see how it's simpler, because if you want to say possession where you've got two souls there, now you've got two souls instead of one. Whereas if you just have one, I mean, and plus, why would simplicity necessarily be the best explanation? And also, that doesn't account for the patterns we see in the data, such as the shorter time between birth rates in Asian countries and the predominance of male previous lives matching the predominance of unnatural deaths in the reincarnation cases and the predominance of unnatural deaths among males.
Yeah, I think it does, because you would. It's just as easy to say a spirit hung around as after death as it would be to say they reincarnated. There'd be more. Also, places with higher birth rates are going to have higher death rates, so you're going to have a higher chance that this is going to happen. And why is simplicity a better explanation? I think was the other one. Did I interpret you correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's Occam's razor. I mean, that's just a foundation for science in general. You never don't multiply postulates beyond what is necessary to explain the phenomena in question. And also, to Cam's point, am I arguing against Stevenson or am I arguing against Arjuna? Well, Arjuna very quickly at the beginning pointed out that his data and all the examples he's giving, I believe maybe with one or two exceptions, come from Stevenson and Tucker. And this is just a conversation we had ahead of time. We wanted to be narrow and focus on certain characters. So Arjuna's case is essentially Stevenson's and Tucker's case is distilled down. So that's why I'm arguing against Stevenson and Tucker. It's just because that this. So I am arguing against Arjuna.
Yeah, fair enough. All right. So what about if we take the rest of this conversation for the open dialogue? What if we look at the first half of your critique, Seth, and then move into the second half? Because we've kind of been going back and forth between the two. Why don't we focus on whether the evidence itself is like good enough to warrant this explanation in the first place, apart from looking at these different explanations?
Sure.
So
right,
yeah,
so
Seth, I mean, just or Arjuna, yeah, if you'd like to go.
So yeah, I mentioned briefly about the Champ Ransom criticisms that the stronger cases aren't subject to that. I mean, leading questions, sure, there could be some question marks there, but often there's things that just can't be explained any other way. For example, one child, and also Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker, the way they report the cases, they're very straight up. When the child is done, when controlled recognitions are done and the child doesn't recognize things, they write it down. They present the strengths and the weaknesses of the cases. But there's some things which provide really interesting evidence, like the boy I mentioned in my opening who described that the previous personality stabbed his wife, and the wife said, yeah, my husband did stab me. Or the boy who was able to locate a gold coin. These things like this you can't chalk down to poor research methodologies. And in the case of Ryan, who remembered the life of Marty Martin, who ran a talent agency and was an unnamed extra in a film, there's no way he could have got this information. The mum was recording the statements as it was going on and emailed Jim Tucker. This is one case where the researchers were on the scene before the previous personality was identified, and there's no way this information could have got there. So with these stronger cases...
Can I bring up something real quick with that one? Just real quick, because I wanted to point out. Is you brought up with Ryan that there's no case of ESP, or in that conversation with Ryan, you said there's no another demonstration of ESP abilities.
It's uncommon.
It's uncommon.
Yeah.
Well, with Ryan, it isn't, because with Ryan's parents have reported that he has, even in older age, had ESP abilities. And I find it quite ironic that his past personality just walked across the screen while his mom was watching a movie as an extra in a movie. When you give him the sheer improbability of that, the later supposed ESP abilities, if we're going to go a supernatural route, again, I'm not saying he does have it, but if he does, why isn't ESP a better explanation for Ryan?
Yeah, so he did display some ESP traits, and then like what Jim Tucker's, what the quote you had from Dr. Ian Stevenson, there's no such thing as a perfect case. So the quote I had from Jim Tucker, that these take place in the messy world, so we don't have tight lab conditions. So we can look at one case for being strong in one area and another case for being strong in another area and say, if this explanation can't explain all these features in this case, and this explanation can't explain all those features in this case, then why think that explanation explains it in this case and that explanation explains it in those cases? If we can rule out an explanation in a few cases, then we've now said, okay, we've got something that's explained by reincarnation and not by other explanations. And then in other cases, we could chalk it down to that. His ESP was, he didn't give immense detailed information about lots of things. Like he said his grandma was going to get chickenpox a few days before she did. He came down with shingles, which is the adult version of chickenpox, and a couple other things like that. But he wasn't reporting intimate details about other people's lives except for this one person. They took him around Hollywood and showed him a person who they thought was the previous personality that wasn't, and he said, I don't know, I don't recognize this. If it was ESP, why wouldn't he be able to tap into ESP about all these other random things? Why just intense detailed information about this one life? And plus there was intense emotions. Like it's exactly what you'd expect if there were emotions carrying over in a person from a previous life. He was having nightmares. They're really disturbed. The other point I forgot to mention in my opening with these cases that's quite interesting is the healing aspect of it. That when people are having phobias or traumas or nightmares, the way that people actually resolve it is by telling them, yeah, this was real. You lived before. Now you're in this life. That was you then. You fought a battle. Sometimes we go through different experiences in life, and sometimes you're a soldier and fighting. And in this life, you don't have to be a soldier. And this makes, like in this one case, the boy's eczema went away. Other cases, people's phobias go away. And this kind of psychological therapy only works from telling these kids, yeah, that was you then, and now you're in this life.
Oh, no.
Yeah, of course, something would happen just right in the middle of it. Oh, there he is. He's joining back. Here we go.
Okay. Thank goodness.
Okay, I'm back. Anyway,
You're back.
I made my point, unless I got cut off early.
Yeah, Seth, go ahead and just come back.
Yeah. So you say, why just one life in the case of Ryan? So 2 points I picked up was, why just the one life in the case of Ryan? Why is he only picking up on Marty Martin, and why his grandma? Again, like, you have to explain why ESP is happening. So let's just take the first example I gave, morphic resonance. What if the child has a sort of cognitive structure similar to Marty Martin, and that's why he was able to pick up on this individual? There might be other individuals, but not all of them walk by on a television camera. It also explains why it's his grandma who would share a similar genetic structure to him. So I think that explains it in a simpler, better way than reincarnation does. It also explains why it happens whenever he walked across the screen. There's probably many individuals out there, they're just probably rare. So this explains both the ESP abilities and the reincarnation. So even in that narrow frame of Ryan's life, it has a greater explanatory scope and a higher simplicity. So it's a superior explanation. So I would say that even in these stronger cases, if we're going to use that filter that I unfortunately took too much time and didn't get to show, yet even if it gets through that evidence, yes, this warrants that there is a phenomenon going on. It's that second filter that's really harmful to the idea that there's strong evidence for reincarnation, because there's just so many other seemingly better explanations. And so, that would be my take.
So with regard to the multiple explanations, you sort of gave, if we give 50% to this explanation being true, and then you say, oh, there's 5 explanations, we give them each 20%. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that's quite how it works. Just because someone can postulate something else doesn't necessarily mean the probability of one being true goes down. I guess, Bayesian logic is not something I'm expert in.
Yeah. So this is, let me clarify. Unfortunately, I was going to say this. I was going to say it's the principle of indifference. Basically, I assume that. So basically, if we have 5 explanations, all things being equal, we just give them all equal probability.
Right. Yeah. Then sure. Then the probability goes down. It's funny when atheists give that argument that like, oh, there's like thousands of gods in different religions, so it's actually 50% that it's atheism and 50% that it's one of thousands of other gods. So the chances of it being God existing is really low. It's like, well, hang on. The atheism is just another side of the die. So that chance of atheism being true is way lower than one of these other supernatural theories.
Right. Definitely.
A little bit off topic, but
no.
So one point with regard to explanations is for people who don't have an existing bias. So they don't believe in reincarnation. They don't have an Eastern worldview. They're not particularly devout Christians. So you know, if you showed them evidence that Christianity wasn't true, they'd be like, oh, okay, fine. When these people are presented with these cases, or even if they are devout Christians and then and they just like have it happen to them, or you know, to someone in their family, and they see, my God, this boy has an incredible amount of information about this past life. It explains their birthmarks. It explains their personality traits. When these people come to accept the data, when they say, okay, I can't just say this is a coincidence. I can't just say this is fraud. This is real, genuine data. Something supernatural is going on. None of these people say, oh, it must be demonic possession. Oh, it must be morphic resonance. They all say, okay, reincarnation must be true. They may say, like there was one case where the mother didn't accept that reincarnation ordinarily happens. She just thought, okay, maybe in this one case, my child is an exception. My child happened to reincarnate, but I'm not going to change my whole worldview just because one person reincarnated. So for ordinary people, the conclusion is reincarnation. And I would argue that based on logic, it's the best explanation too. You have a carryover of personality. Why not think it's the same person?
Yeah. I would also, I mean, taking public polls, though, I don't think necessarily amounts to much. If the scientific explanation, 500 years ago, the best scientific explanation wasn't, but a few hundred years ago would have been that the sun goes or the Earth goes around the sun. You don't go and say, well, most people believe that the sun goes around the Earth. It just seems more obvious to them that the sun goes around the Earth. I mean, just look at it; it's moving. It was there at 1 o'clock. Reincarnation is obviously a prominent position, but that's also because it's got a long history within religions, and morphic resonance is a very scientifically sophisticated position, along with the across the A field of Erwin Laszlo and a lot of these other positions. So, I don't think that necessarily raises the probability of reincarnation just because a lot of people believe it or jump to that.
So let me say just 2 things, and then I'll let you guys go back at it. So we are going to do some Q&A in about, say, 20 minutes, a little bit around 20 minutes from now. So if you have a question for either guest, either Seth or Arjuna, then make sure to leave it in the live chat and address who it's supposed to be addressed to. So like if it's Arjuna, semicolon, blah, blah, blah. Here's my question. So, and that'll just help me know who to ask the question to when we get to that period. And I also wanted to provide a little bit of clarity on Seth's math back when he was talking about that. So what I took Seth to be arguing was that we have these 5 different No, you don't. You don't need to. Okay. It's okay. We have these 5 explanations, but you also argued that some of these have greater explanatory scope and explanatory power. Mm-hmm. So you weren't just saying that here's this possibility. You were saying, hey, this is actually a good explanation. It's actually a better explanation in these certain respects. So it's not as if it's just a possibility, even though the possibility of it could be enough. I think the case is stronger. Maybe that's what I'm convincing myself of as I'm saying this out loud. I think your case is stronger than you were sort of leading on for it to be, because you weren't just saying that this is possible and we have these 5 different explanations. We're just going to split the probability up between the 5. You're saying these are actually better explanations. So maybe the probability of reincarnation is even lower. Like these others should take up the more a greater range of the possibility space.
Yeah, and again, I got cut off, and it's unfortunate because that was me synthesizing everything I'd said. Unfortunately, the percentage I gave, 20%, is 1 out of 5. It's a prior probability before any evidence comes into play, right? But of course, I gave reasons why we should prefer the other one. So that's why if you see very quickly, it says less than 20%, and that should have been less than or equal to, but 20%. I thought you said 10%. Max. So 10% at the very bottom, right? Because there's about a 50%
at the very top.
So at the very top, whether or not there is a phenomenon that needs to be explained, I gave it a 50%. That because there's so many flaws in the data, whether or not there's even a phenomenon going on.
Oh, right, that's what you're saying.
Is about 50%, right? It's about 50%. So thank you for allowing me to clarify this. It's about 50%. And that's just, I mean, give or take. There's flaws in the research. I mean, even Stevenson and Tucker admit this. So I think I'm being fair to them by giving it about 50% chance. They don't deal with proof. They just say there's some evidence, right? But then, okay, so 50% chance that. The explanations, well, there's 5, right? So there's 20% chance this, 20% chance this, 20% chance. So when you take these and multiply them together, that the chances that reincarnation is the best explanation of the phenomena of children remembering their past lives, about 10% max. So, and that's that's not good. That's not strong evidence. So 10% is not strong evidence. Max. Sorry.
What if I give 10 different reincarnation hypotheses, and then we've got 10 plus the 4 others?
Mm-hmm. Well, the question is are they sort of metaphysically, different enough to count as independent hypotheses, right? Because there were quite a few that I threw off or combined. We talked about memory bundles, you and I, before the debate. I didn't think that was different enough from the New Stone tape, is what I called it, to consider it a different hypothesis completely. Because reincarnation, all these 10 different models are going to use the exact same explanation to explain the phenomenon. So, having slight nuances in the data doesn't make that, a more probable, not adding probability. That's not how probability works, obviously. But I get what you're saying. It's just, to clarify my method, if they're literally saying the explanation for the phenomenon is appealing to something metaphysically different.
I'll just put a different touchpad on them and sell them each for a different price, and then we'll get 10 different models.
Does that make sense, though? Yeah, does my logic, was that a good explanation, Arjuna?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Okay. So, yeah, obviously, I would need to argue that the evidence can't be explained by other methods, and these alternative explanations you've got are not the best explanations. So,
right.
I didn't mean to make an argument from popularity. We could say perhaps it's an argument from an unbiased, rational party. So,
what I was thinking. I know I'm kind of cutting you off here, but what I was thinking was, instead of, because we don't have that much time left, we can't go through all of the explanations. What if we just went through one of them as sort of a case study and be like, okay, the one for morphic resonance, say, and we don't have to do that one. We're saying maybe we could just look at one of these as opposed to having you try to refute all of them in 5 minutes. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So maybe Seth can present his strongest one, and when I can derail that one, then we'll just leave everyone to assume that I can derail.
Yeah, it was a bit of a shotgun approach, which I apologize for, but there was no way to reduce the probability and explain my reasoning outside of, presenting these. So I apologize for that.
Yeah.
I think what would be better is if, I guess I could just do that. I was going to say you could always argue why reincarnation explains more of the data than any possible other competing hypothesis. But let's just take morphic resonance. I'm not saying that's the best one. I don't know, because I don't necessarily buy into any of these. But morphic resonance, Rupert Sheldrake argues that form retains memory. So creatures of different forms, this is how he explains migration. How do creatures automatically know where to migrate to if they've never gone on a migration pattern? They don't have parents to teach them. There's quite a few species that do this. Monarch butterflies, quite a few species of birds that from after they hatch, they know exactly where to go. And so he thinks it's tied to the form of the creature itself. And so there you got, it's a form of memory being passed between lives that in no way appeals to reincarnation. So just thoughts on that?
So morphic resonance, the theory put forward by Rupert Sheldrake, is used to explain the examples you gave. For example, when mice in one part of the country are put through a maze or, some kind of learning device, and they learn something new, then researchers in another part of the world with other mice who are a similar form, similar body type, but aren't genetically related, they're not descendants, then learn that thing faster. Or when chemists create a molecule for the first time, it's harder to form it. It takes longer for it to form. And once it's been made later after that, it forms faster. So Rupert uses morphic resonance to explain this, that a structure retains a certain energy field, and when you have that structure somewhere else, it can carry that. You're now trying to use it to explain something very specific, a connection between one person and another person. And that goes beyond what the theory is hypothesized to do. Rupert Sheldrake, you said, commented that it does explain the memories of the evidence for past lives. I mean, him saying that doesn't necessarily mean it is the best explanation. I think he has an interesting theory. I just don't think it applies here. You have a radio and you tune it to a certain frequency and you get a radio station, but you don't have a specific radio station you can get that nobody else can get. Anyone can tune into those radio stations. So what we would expect from morphic resonance is a more generic thing, that one person would be able to access multiple people's past memories who were all similar. We wouldn't expect this kind of specificity where it's only one person.
Well, I would actually push back on that and say, I think he would say that. Not only has he commented that, but his entire book's Dogs That Know When Their Owners Come Home give very specific memories of like single dogs that somehow know when their owners are coming home without any sort of sensory information. So it does have a specificity to it, right? So he's very much of the persuasion that you can form morphic fields in singular instances, not just in these sort of general instances of species migrations or development, right? So yeah, I would push back and say, yeah, I think it is. I think he's not pushing his idea. I don't want to call it a theory, obviously. I don't want to say he's pushing his idea too far when he says Stevenson and Tucker's research is explained by this.
So the dogs, and he's also got the telephone cases where people are able to identify who's calling them with higher than chance rates. That's a kind of telepathic connection, and that's a well understood phenomenon that, you know, when someone's relative dies and they're really close to that person, they had a sense of knowing ahead of time. Or things of this sort. The dogs knowing when their owner coming from, are obviously having a kind of mental platform connection. So it's a kind of telepathic connection with their owner, that they're connecting to an energy field. But this is not the same as connecting with, you know, I wouldn't think these dogs are having an identity that I am my owner, I was my owner, or I'm having detailed memories from the owner. They're just having some kind of connection where they can know things like when they're coming home.
Yeah, because they can pick up on the congruent intentionality, right? And so the idea is that the mental fields, my mental field is connected somehow with my dog's mental field, right? And that would include memories. That could include memories, because that's why he thinks migration is explained by this and development is explained by this. So no, the analogy is not perfect, but that doesn't mean that the idea itself of morphic resonance doesn't explain that. By saying that memory is tied to form, it doesn't. I'm failing. I guess I'm not seeing why the objection is why this can't apply in this case.
Well, it just doesn't seem like the best explanation, because you're taking a phenomenon that's quite general and making it specific. So, you just
it does happen in every specific case. Like with every specific monarch butterfly that migrates, right? It inherits memories, right? And those memories have to be pretty specific. It's where to migrate to, right?
Well, we don't know what the experience is like for the butterflies. It could just be a sense that I need to go in this direction. Like, humans, I mean, we can't remember being newborn babies, but babies just, you know, have instinctive survival mechanisms. They know how to latch and feed. They know how to do various other things. And these aren't necessarily just like a memory of doing it. It's just kind of an impulse where you find yourself doing the muscle actions that give that consequence.
Well, he would say it is. He would explain instinct as a form of memory as well, because there's obviously no genetic code. Like there's a certain kind of wasp that knows exactly where it's stinging its prey, and it's like a nearly surgical strike. But there's obviously nothing in its genetic code that programs it to that. It somehow just remembers. It just knows.
Right. I mean,
right?
You're calling it a memory, which is fine, but it doesn't mean we're talking about the same thing here as a memory that I have of what I did last week or 10 years ago, or what these children were reporting of their previous lives. That a memory in terms of an instinct is not like a cognitive thing in the same way as a memory.
But Stevenson himself... Sorry, go ahead.
It's an impulse to perform a behavior rather than a memory of images and sounds. Yeah,
but Rupert Sheldrake himself calls it a memory. In fact, the entire idea is built on the formation of these morphic fields, which are based in memory, because it's based on the philosophy. It's based on the philosophy of Bergson, who believes that his durational philosophy. I don't want to get too into philosophy, but that memory is sort of preserved through time, right? And that's the idea he's operating off of. And yeah, so if Rupert Sheldrake is correct, then that it is memory, then it does explain dogs that know their owners come home. It does explain instinct, and it would also explain this, right? So that's why I think this has a much larger explanatory scope, because he has one simple hypothesis. It says Bergson was right, that memory is preserved through form. And then it has this broad explanatory scope. And wonderful. And yes, the instances are going to be very different, but I consider that a strength of the theory, that it explains everything. I don't consider that a weakness of the theory, that it has that it can explain vastly different phenomena.
I think that this actually opens us up to a kind of last Thursdayism objection again, because if morphic resonance can explain memories, how someone got memories of a past life, then how do I know my memories of my childhood are mine? How do I know they didn't come to me through morphic resonance and they're actually the memories of somebody different?
Right, because what it would take is, and how he would say that is you have to share a highly analogous relationship to the brain structure, which is why, again, this explains why it nearly always happens in families, right? So which are extremely complex structures, but just on occasion, by random chance, when you have 7 billion people in the world, you're going to get some slight similarities between the cognitive structures and the form of a young child and a previous person, right? And so that's why you don't have to worry about that, because the odds of it happening are extremely rare. So it actually even explains the rarity of these cases. One of the things reincarnation hypothesis unexplained is, why are these so remarkably rare? There's a lot of people who die violently, but very, very few children who have these experiences. Morphic resonance has that explanatory power to explain the rarity of these, and also why we don't have to worry about, that the world was created last Thursday or having a bunch of false memories, because the odds of this are so remarkably small.
So the rarity is easy to explain. Remembering past lives is not necessarily beneficial, and we don't know yet that the people who do reincarnate with memories, they do seem to be rare. And the people who die violently and don't reincarnate, maybe they went to another planet and reincarnated there. So there could be various other places they took birth. Maybe they took birth as an animal. There's so many places a soul could go to take birth that the rarity doesn't need to be explained. Same family cases are explained very simply by emotional and karmic ties, by attachments. People want to continue in the same family, or they've got some karmic bondages with that family, so they need to live out, so they take birth in the same family.
Yeah, but Stevenson himself says there are cases where they reincarnate a family that they have no relationship to, and he says he can't explain that. I have it written in my notes that he's completely baffled by cases of this, whereas morphic resonance would probably be able to explain that just by sheer coincidence. It's not going to happen as often, but it will happen.
Explaining it by coincidence, I don't know if I'd call that an explanation.
Sure. But I mean, here's the thing, we could say that the Earth has a lot of finely tuned mechanisms for the existence of life, but given that there's, trillions of planets out there, I don't consider this a good apologetic case for the world being designed, right? Not, at least not on its own, right? When you have when you have billions and billions, or even like tons and tons of cases, coincidence just by sheer chance can be an explanation. That's a loose analogy, but hopefully it communicates what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, I mean, on the Hare Krishna view, the theology, the worldview I hold, that it's not weird to see people taking birth in a family where they have no connection. I mean, there's a limited number of bodies that you can take birth in at any one time, because only so many people are having kids, and there's different experiences which we need to have in each life. So we take birth in different places to have those different experiences, and it's described we have unlimited karma because we've lived so many lives. So
right.
And the karma we live in any one life is just a tiny fraction of the pile of karma we have. So them taking birth in a different family with different people, completely unrelated, could just be that they happen to have karma with those people from a previous life, or that those are the experiences, that body's going to give them the experiences they need in that life to learn and grow.
Now, all of this can be true, right? But since we're dealing with strong scientific evidence, right, what we ended up doing is importing a lot of hypotheses to explain the evidence. I'm importing other planets with other life forms on it to explain why it's not as common, right? Because the data set we have is pretty uncommon. We're importing the idea that there's karmic ties to family, but in the cases where it's not, we're importing ideas of past karmic ties. So again, we're adding hypothesis to hypothesis to presumption to presumption. And with every single one you add, you're beginning to really, really violate Occam's razor. And these other simpler hypotheses, which explain it without these having to import other hypotheses, they begin to look more attractive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so bringing in these other explanations of different places a soul could take birth, it's not, you could say it's bringing in another postulate, but all it's doing is answering a logical objection. So here's a logical problem, here's the logical solution. And that just cancels the objection. It's not that we have to prove that all these other places exist where souls can take birth. We just have to say, well, the logical objection fails because we have hypotheses which account for this data.
Right. But let me give you an illustration, right? So suppose like we need to explain, why my TV broke. And I could say, well, a wire cut short, or I could say that elves are manipulating it. Well, there's an additional hypothesis that elves exist, right? Now, I know I'm not trying to belittle reincarnation. I'm just trying to, it was the first thing that comes to mind. But then I was like, well, I don't see the elves. Well, because they're invisible. Well, surely I'd run into them. Well, they're extremely fast, right? You see why adding these hypotheses more and more. And I use this stupid, silly illustration just to sort of illustrate that adding hypotheses, it gets rid of the logical. You're right. You're 100% right. It gets rid of the logical problem. But the question is scientific evidence, right? The question is evidence. Does this count as scientific evidence? And the more we have to add, the less and less probability we can really assign to these explanations, because you're having to introduce all these additional things. It's sort of like geocentrism. We could come up with a coherent model of geocentrism today if you come up with all these additional ideas and stuff. Like back in the day, they introduced epicycles and had all this real complex theory just to keep the Earth at the center of the solar system. Eventually, it was abandoned, not from just purely scientific evidence. People realized that heliocentrism was just a lot simpler. They didn't have to have all these additional hypotheses. And I think we're in a similar situation here.
Well, one thing is, I'm not bringing in postulates that I invented in order to answer the objection. I'm bringing in postulates which are described in ancient Vedic literature. Mm-hmm. And they just happen to give a perfectly consistent account of the available data, which is an interesting coincidence. I don't think the Christian account can explain for this data in quite the same way. I think these explanations you're giving are kind of ad hoc attempts to squeeze the data onto alternative theories. With the morphic resonance thing, just the idea that there's like we could give an analogy to radio tuning, that our brains are like radio frequencies, and everyone's got a different setting on the radio dial, and every now and again you got two people who've got the same setting on the radio dial, and in these cases you get carryover. But I mean, that wouldn't explain why you get memories from the previous life or near the end of the previous life. Well, why isn't the person remembering clearly everything about that person's life? They're only remembering things that would have been prominent to the person at the end of the life of the previous personality, which is what you'd expect on reincarnation.
Seth, before you come back in, we are going to turn to some Q&A. Are you okay with switching there now? Okay.
Yeah.
What you got going on, Arjuna? Close that window. The light looked beautiful on you. I mean, it was like highlighting your. Anyway, all right. Let's get to some questions. Okay, so we actually had a really nice comment come in, and I wanted to highlight it because it was just really cool. Expose Andy says, "I've never heard this deep discussion about reincarnation. Interesting. Didn't know this was big." That's part of the reason why. Like when I heard Arjuna do this debate, I didn't know that either. I didn't know that there was all this evidence from these, the previous lives of these children and stuff. Like I didn't know that any of that existed. And it was just really interesting to hear about it and how there does seem to be some good evidence for reincarnation on the surface, right? And so that's why I wanted to have a dialogue about it on the channel. Yeah, so that's it. Do either of you have any thoughts on this comment before we go to the questions?
That's the thing I like to do with my channel, but bring deeper discussions and educate people on the subjects.
Yeah, I definitely will say that this was a lot bigger back in like the 80s and 90s. It seems like, I'm sure Arjuna can attest to this, is like so much of the source material out there is a little outdated. So if we can bring more light to this, it's pretty great, because I think it is an interesting topic. Despite my incredulity and my terrible Christian presuppositions, I think it's very interesting.
I did want to say, I mean, I don't want to get on, make it appear like I'm being impartial here, but I did have a way of explaining your point, Seth, that I think might be helpful, because I'm like, I think in Bayesian terms a lot. And basically, I think what your point is like, if you add all these different hypotheses, have you heard of probabilistic tension? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Robin Collins introduces that in his paper on fine tuning. Yeah. And so if you do that, basically what happens is that the prior probability lowers. If your hypothesis turns out to be like a conjunction of many different hypotheses, then when you multiply all those together, basically the prior probability of your hypothesis goes super, super low. And that happens even when you have a hypothesis to kind of respond to something that Arjuna was saying. And again, that makes me sound like I'm not being impartial. But I think this would be helpful. I think it'd be helpful. So if, because you were saying like it's not as if you just like made up this hypothesis. So it's not ad hoc. right? It's like it came from this previously existing. So what you could say then in that case is that like the prior probability for that one conjunct of your hypothesis, the prior probability for that one is a little bit higher than the others. So like you'd still be multiplying like 0.1 times maybe 0.5 or 0.6 times 0.1 times 0.1. So in the end, you'd still wind up with a really, really low prior probability, even if you had a bunch of high probabilities. The point is that you've got these different hypotheses. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I tried to avoid that. I actually had a Bayesian formula where I put it up, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to go through this. Because then I'm assigning prior probabilities to reincarnation, that reincarnation could provide the evidence. So I like your illustration. I think that's great. But and the reason, and just full disclosure, the reason I didn't do that is I didn't want to sort of get too much into the weeds of probability. But I guess that was inevitable.
Well, I feel like, okay, Arjuna, please say something on that to respond.
Yeah, I don't get too much into Bayes. I like to get more into like what's the best explanation, and because you only use Bayesian reasoning when all explanations are equal, and I think we can spend more time figuring out if they are equal or not. No.
No, let's do the questions. We were supposed to do the questions. Let's move to that now. All right. Yeah. Brando says, question for Arjuna: other than a tu quoque argument against Christians for this being demon possession instead of reincarnation, is there any other reason it couldn't be possession?
Is there any other what does he mean by tu quoque?
He's talking about your last Thursdayism objection.
Right. So so other than last Thursdayism,
yeah.
Well, I think that if we're talking about reincarnation, possession in terms of there being two souls present, I'd say it would be a good explanation if you had like a tug of war between two different personality types. Like maybe this explains people with bipolar personality disorder, or maybe that's just a mental illness. I don't know, but this may explain those kinds of things. Like you get people with split personality disorder where one personality has anaphylactic allergies and the other doesn't. These kinds of things might be explained by two different souls manifesting in that body. But when you have a continuity where the person from birth is exhibiting the same personality traits, same personality present when they're talking about the memories, then I don't think demon possession is a good explanation.
Yeah, I'll go to
demon
that.
Possession's weird. I'm more into the possession by the previous personality than
I treated them equally because again, that's not a metaphysically different. That was one of the examples where I was like, that's not different enough to really count them as two separate hypotheses. It's both a spirit in each case, whether or not it's a demon or a previous person, soul. Who cares? It's the same metaphysical idea going on there. Same ideas essentially happening. What I was going to say is with the tu quoque, notice that you were importing theology from Hare Krishna, from Vaishnavism into it. Well, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? Because as soon as you do that, then Christians can import demonic theology into it. Demons. So you could say, well, God's not going to allow demons to have that much power to completely fool us about the resurrection and all these sorts of things. It's very similar to what Descartes did in his philosophy. So, I mean, as soon as if we're going to allow that in to sort of save the reincarnation hypothesis, well, then immediately for soul possession and for a very Christian perspective, which is demonic possession, well, we're allowed to do that as well. And all of a sudden, these hypotheses are back on equal weight again.
Would you like to move to the next question or come back on that, Arjuna?
Just quickly, like I said about the possession isn't the best explanation when you have a continuity of personality. It's only the best explanation when you have a different personality. Like you can kind of recognize a personality trait, and when a personality, and when someone's behaving a bit differently, it seems like a different person. This would work when that's going on in the cases, but in a lot of these cases, there's a continuity of personality.
All right, let's move on to another question. This one's from Brute Facts Podcast. He says, for Arjuna, what is the motivation for holding to reincarnation? For Seth, when do I get my rematch at Topgolf?
Anytime, buddy.
Motivation.
Anytime.
This might be a good excuse for me to quickly touch on the theological objections. I don't think I made notes on them. So theologically speaking, we have benefits from... explanatory benefits. Yeah, here we go. Explains the birthmarks, explains personality traits, but the theological ones, it solves the problem of evil. So eternal conscious torment is no longer, you don't have to worry about that anymore, because instead you just get infinite chances to reincarnate. It gives purpose to life. So if you can need a do-over because you stuffed up and you didn't learn the lesson you didn't make the personal transformation you didn't need, then it means, and you get a do-over and you can actually get a chance to get it right, then it means this life actually has a purpose. There's something to achieve, which you can fail to achieve, and then you get another chance at doing it. And it explains disparities and birth. So basically, you can have a view of God being all-loving when you bring in reincarnation, because this is God giving us a sensible kind of purgatory, allowing us to, if you want to be separate from God, you can go and try to enjoy in the material world. That's one thing you can do with reincarnation, or you can use it to try to develop love of God. So we can have a view that God's all-loving if we bring reincarnation into the picture.
Seth, did you want to come back on that at all before we move to the next one?
Yeah,
I've had two debates on my channel on the subject with Seth.
Yeah, we have. Yeah, so go watch those debates. That actually wasn't what I was going to say, but great point. What I was just going to say is, yeah, that's theologically, that's fantastic. I obviously don't want to touch on this too much because we're talking about scientific evidence and not about, psychological benefits or theological coherence or anything like that. So I just wanted to be pretty narrow. So I'll leave Arjuna with that and reference you to his channel.
So from Watchman, question, has anyone remembered being another animal, fish, insect, even plant?
Yeah, there were some cases that are mentioned. I didn't bring them up because obviously there's time problems. I would advise people, if they're interested in this, to read the books written by Jim Tucker. In his most recent book, he talks about a few cases. So there was one boy who described the life of a snake, and there was some veridical aspect to the memories because he described being killed, and there was actually a story that snake being killed, and he knew which person killed the snake, and that his father in that life was present there. So yeah, there is that. There was another case where he said his sister had become a fish. This was obviously an intermission memory or something.
They are.
Seth, do you know of any others?
No,
they're uncommon.
I don't. They're extremely uncommon. Most are person to person.
People probably don't talk about them as much. Oh, there was another case where they mark the body of the previous personality to see if they can identify the person in the next life. So the person will have a matching birthmark. They did this with their dog once, and then they had someone born in the family that had the mark, which they put on the dog.
All right, let's move on to a question from Brando. He's asked a bunch of questions. So here's another one for Arjuna. Would it be hypothetically possible to have reincarnation inception, remembering memories of a person remembering memories? Has this happened, or could it?
There are cases where people have remembered more than one lifetime.
Oh, yeah.
And some of these cases where the person remembered details about a previous life that seemed to be accurate, and then were telling memories that seemed to be inaccurate. Perhaps they were mixing lifetimes. Maybe he's making a joke about remembering. I'm not aware of any cases of someone remembering a previous life where they're remembering a previous life.
How would that work if you've got two previous lives that you're remembering? There's some explanation, right, Arjuna, that like there's a certain age where you just stop remembering your past lives.
Oh, yes. So I was saying like childhood amnesia, where someone is remembering multiple lives. Probably what happened is, like, people in a near-death experience, they often describe having their whole life flash before their eyes. So possibly in some intermission between lives, they were presented with information, with memories. They accessed memories of more than one life, and those stayed prominent in their mind into this life. This is my explanation.
Yeah, I will say only on that note, it is, I find it funny. It wasn't part of my case because, I was speaking at 90 miles an hour to begin with, was that between lives, the sort of intermediate period when there are memories, they seem to be highly culturally specific. So for instance, in North American tribes, they talk about crossing a river on a canoe. There's other ones that have a strong view, monotheistic view, that talk about being in the presence of God. And Stevenson, I do remember an offhand comment. He says, I think some sort of, cultural elements have entered into this belief and shaped them and wrapped them up. Well, that's the sort of thing that's sort of like, well, if it can impact those memories, how do you know the culture hasn't also impacted, the lives, the physical lives themselves, the previous personality itself? So you get into some weird territory there.
Are you talking about the intermission memories that people report different non-bodied existences?
Yeah.
I would explain that God is multifarious, and he appears to us in a way that suits our expectations, so that he can meet our needs
Yeah.
in that way.
Again, that's an additional hypothesis, which is the culture is a much more mundane hypothesis, and I think Stevenson was right to opt for that, but I don't think he clearly saw how that relates to his case.
Well,
right.
You're only bringing in one thing, and that's a perfect being. And once you've got that perfect being, it explains all these other things.
Right.
I'd say reincarnation even logically follows from perfect being theism, because then you can allow God to be all loving, which is a whole other debate.
That is a whole nother debate. I won't touch that because we'll be there all day. You are importing one extra thing, but that is an extra thing, right? And that's and Stevenson himself very clearly said culture can easily account for this, right? And that's already there. You don't have to postulate that as some extra unknown thing, right? So again, I'm not saying it's wrong. I mean, it could be wrong, but scientifically, we're talking about scientific evidence, right? Prefer the simpler hypothesis. That's why I think he did it, because he was working as a scientist, right? Or as a psychologist.
I would agree that in this case, where we can say people's cultural expectations are being projected and they're just imagining things based on their cultural expectations, that we could say that's an equal explanation to the theology which I presented, the worldview I presented. But with them both being equal, then it just comes back to, what's the evidence we were talking about before, and is this objection, does it tell us that we shouldn't believe in this particular conclusion? If they're both equal, it doesn't. So then we just go back to the other.
Right. What I'm saying is not that they're equal. I'm saying one is simpler, much simpler, because it doesn't have to. One says culture can account for this fake memory, or a cultural importation of memory. One says, well, God worked with the culture, right? There's an extra thing there, right? And so if we're going to talk about scientific evidence, we're going to prefer the purely cultural explanation that can account for the data without invoking an additional hypothesis and a conjunct. And as soon as you do that, and Stevenson, I think, rightly accepts that, you all of a sudden, you have to ask the question of why isn't he accepting the same sort of cultural impact on prior life memories as well?
But again, we're only accepting, if you already accept perfect being theism, then the idea that always goes along with that is that God's intimately involved in basically every aspect of our lives, especially for someone devoted to him. So this idea that God's involved in the nature of reality is not an additional thing to bringing in if you already believe God exists.
Yeah, again, we're talking about scientific evidence, right? So we're having to import a theology, right?
Right. So if I was debating an atheist, then the arguments would be a little bit different. But you want to argue against the evidence for reincarnation while maintaining a Christian worldview.
Yeah, a Christian worldview that doesn't accept it, because it's not just that God exists, right? It's also the idea that God works through reincarnation, that God meets people culturally rather than giving them a far more similar experience, which would add to the veridicality of it, which seems to be one of the only reasons I could think a divine God would allow kids to go through such traumatic experiences, is to demonstrate the veridicality of reincarnation, right? And so again, there's a lot of extra assumptions that you're importing there, and more than just simple theism. And again, I'll admit theism is an additional one, but it's not one I'm using to invoke, right? So it still is simpler. So anyway.
Yeah, let's see if we can move on to another question. Right. We've been going on that one a little while. Hector Contrero says, and this is for both of you guys, is there a link between reincarnation and deja vu? Could it be possible that it is a neurological response or memory carried through genetics?
I mean, it could be a past life thing, or it could be a genetic neurological thing where our brain's just triggered by something that it knows about genetically from our ancestors. I don't think you could go. I mean, if you already believed in reincarnation, maybe you could say deja vu was a likely explanation. But other than that, I'd say it's open to multiple explanations.
Stevenson does say he thinks that it could explain that as well. So,
what could explain that? Reincarnation could explain deja vu.
Yeah.
How reincarnation would explain deja vu? So how would that work?
Yeah. Sort of a suppressed memory of having been there in a previous life. And so whenever you're there, you're like, I've been here before. Yeah, okay. I've been here before. You have. You just weren't you.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, here's another question from Watchman. He says, is it possible to project externally into the mind with something like remote viewing? Do either of you know what remote viewing is?
I think he's saying, somebody use remote viewing to access internal memories and get and it be as if, that might be how they
someone interpret this for me.
Remote viewing is the idea that I can right now, using my mental ability, see what's going on in Sri Lanka and look inside their military facility and see what secret weapons the Sri Lanka, I don't know, so I'm making this up, but that's remote viewing, right? Something
Gotcha.
very Stranger Things-esque.
So I think he's asking if you could use remote viewing to access another person's memories, and if this might explain the reincarnation evidence data. Perhaps, but I don't know if that's just the clearest explanation of the data.
It would be another ESP, a hypothesis of ESP. I don't consider those because I don't see any sort of mechanism for how they work. Doesn't mean it's not real. Project Stargate by the government was an attempt to use remote viewing by the US government for spying. Now, it didn't, the results were pretty inconclusive, but nevertheless, the reason I'm not even invoking this as a possible explanation is because how does that work? There's no mechanism given for it. And I wanted to restrict myself to possible mechanisms for, those seem to be a bit more solid rock rather than just multiplying every random idea that was out there.
All right, we've got a question that just was sent in as a super chat, so thanks, Sai. He or she says, and this one seems to be addressed to Seth, seems the only case against reincarnation is to essentially dismiss the evidence as being hallucinatory. Have I missed something?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that it's all hallucinatory. I've included fraud. I've included false memories. I include a lot of things: bad data recording, credulity of Ian Stevenson, and that was just part one, right? And then I could say, well, let's say the children really are remembering previous lives, and then I gave those 5 hypotheses, reincarnation being one. And I gave those 5 hypotheses and just said, you know what? Equal accountability for all. And I didn't even include, what's funny is I didn't even include my personal one at the end. So there's technically 6, but I didn't include that one. I just threw that out there because I thought it was interesting. That all of these equally explain the data. And so if we're going to just principle of indifference, give them all equal probability, the odds that reincarnation is the explanation for the given phenomena is pretty low.
What about you, Arjuna? Any thoughts on this one?
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Seth gave far more arguments than just saying it was hallucinatory. I think maybe he missed Seth's opening. I was keeping notes and thinking,
maybe he missed the first part of it. Yeah. Okay. Let's do one more, and then we'll move to some closing thoughts. All right. Gentile bride. Question: will they only have information of previous life if they were human in past life? Hinduism teaches you can be an animal in your past life. This is kind of similar to the one we answered before, but they're a Christian from India.
Yeah, there are
cases.
Cover it again. I mean, there's even cases in our scripture where people remember a life as an animal, but these are cases where the person was extremely spiritual advanced and then did some kind of fall down where they took birth as an animal. And in that life as an animal, they remembered their life as a human doing spiritual practice, and then they took a third birth where they were extremely spiritual advanced, and then after that went back to Godhead.
Anything else to add, Seth?
That's good enough.
Cool. All right, let's move to some closing thoughts. So why don't we start with Seth, and then we'll give Arjuna the last word.
Yeah, so I just want to go back to my filter. When we look at all the evidential problems that I've rehashed, there's dozens and dozens and dozens of problems that crop up with the case in favor of that children do in fact remember their past lives. They're not fresh enough. There false memories, there's false witnesses, there's fraud. Stevenson's had bad record of recording, even by his own assistant's testimony. When you begin to multiply these out, I gave it no more than a 50% probability that there even is this phenomenon occurring. I think that's a fair, even generous percentage. And then I looked at 5 other explanations, and one I didn't even account for. And threw in reincarnation as a 6th one, And then I showed that all 5 of these have a greater explanatory scope and are simpler than reincarnation. So given all of this, can we say, the topic of the debate, is there strong evidence for reincarnation? I put the probability at 10%. It's probably in the single digits, given everything considered. Generously, we could say 10%. That's not good evidence. And I don't think we've heard anything here that's really sort of overwhelmingly showed that. And just maybe as a last quick thought, Arjuna brought up the case of James Linegar and the case of Kumkum. Many of the problems that I listed, couldn't talk about them specifically, but many of them also correspond to these cases. So for instance, with James Linegar, he was taken to, he was the one who had the airplanes that he'd crash into the table. And then he'd have nightmares about crashing in a plane. This all happened after he was taken to a naval aeronautics museum. After he saw these planes, he also got a lot of things wrong, like the plane he crashed in. And people say, well, look, he got the name of the previous personality right. He got the name James right, which is his own name. So many of these cases, under close examination, they seem really strong, but they don't. Just to quote this from James Lineker, this comes from David Christopher Lane, a philosopher, who examined the case with some credulity toward it. This is what he said. Now, has James Lineker been fully debunked? No. But there are enough reasonable doubts and questions to make the story less convincing? Yes. Now, that I could do this with all the cases. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time. But if you look at them and look them up, every single one of these supposedly strong cases also succumbs to the evidence. And that's just the first part of the filter. As soon as you put it in, the second part, the odds of reincarnation being the explanation of this become vanishingly small. That doesn't mean it's false, but don't let someone tell you that scientific evidence warrants it.
All right, let's switch to Arjuna. Do you have any closing thoughts? And none of this was planned at all, so don't feel like pressure that you've got to give some like amazing closing speech or anything. But do you have any closing thoughts on the dialogue today?
Yeah. So my case is that there are possible alternative explanations. I think reincarnation is the best explanation, but I don't think it's conclusive. I wouldn't say it's proven. Like Seth said, there are flaws with every case. But many of the cases show features which are difficult to explain by any other means. And of course, when they compile all the data together, we find patterns. For example, the rates of past lives with an unnatural death matches the rates of males who die of an unnatural death. The rates of males. Anyway, I made that point earlier. With the fraud explanation, so some cases are shown to be fraud, but then there's aspects that can't be explained based on fraud, such as the information that Ryan gave, or the locating of a gold coin, saying to the brother of the previous personality that I'd given him a Chicky 16, which is a rare kind of pistol that was uncommon in the location where they were, and so on. So the boy saying he'd stabbed his wife in the past life, and this being true. These are very specific kinds of information that you can't explain with fraud. With James Lineker, that case has gotten a lot of limelight, and like you said, a philosopher has written a quite reasonable critique of the case. Him saying he crashed in the wrong plane. He said he was in a Corsair, but he'd actually flown Corsairs and was part of the Air Force division that tested them for the American Air Force. And flying them was quite a memorable experience. He also gave correct information about how they get a lot of flat tires. I'm not sure the details of the progression of the case because I didn't study that one extensively, but going to the museum, the flight museum, could have just jogged his memory off. It does happen in these cases sometimes, that something jogs their memory of the past life and then the memories come up. But the nightmares aren't explained just by going to the museum. And so finally, with regard to the competing explanations, I would say, what would a non-biased, rational epistemic agent conclude when they looked at this data? So when somebody looks at this data and they don't have a worldview which pushes them dogmatically in a particular direction, what are they going to conclude? And we see when this happens, when there's people that don't have a dogmatic position, and they come to accept this data, that it's not explained by fraud or coincidence or imagination, then they conclude that, at least in this case, this child is a reincarnation of the previous personality. So on that grounds, I would argue it's the best explanation for the data.
Arjuna, we didn't give you a chance to talk about your channel at all at the very beginning of this. So tell everyone like what your channel is, the name of it. I've got it linked in the description of this video if you guys want to go check it out. But what kind of stuff do you do on your channel?
Yeah, so the channel's called Theology Unleashed. I haven't actually explained the name. I spent a long time thinking of that.
It's a really cool name.
The idea is to unshackle theology from the sectarian chains that have been binding it for so long. So, I appreciate your channel quite a lot, Cameron. It's quite an honor to be on here. I started watching your channel a couple of years ago, back when you only had 20,000 subscribers, and then I thought, I want to do something like that. So my channel's somewhat modeled after your channel, and then I managed to get Seth on as one of the first podcasts. So it's an interesting coincidence that we're on here.
Believe it or not,
now.
we're more friends than enemies.
Yeah. It's fun debating him. He gives good objections. I remember when I had him on debating Akshay Gupta on my channel, who's another PhD candidate on the problem of evil. I'm thinking, geez, I didn't know you could have objections this good to our theology. I didn't know that was possible. And they're like good, well thought out objections. It's not this like point scoring stuff. So yeah, I try to host high quality discussions and bring the Eastern theology perspective. But I do get things on with just Christians often. I've had Michael Egner on a few times and Stephen Meyer, and yeah, try to have open dialogues and do philosophy of religion. And also, sometimes I make short videos, but I struggle to find time for that, having a family and a job.
Yeah, the live streams are easier. Yeah, go ahead, Seth.
I was going to say, I will say he runs a great channel. I'm not just saying that because I've been on it. I mean, in all seriousness, David Bentley Hart, Steve Meyer, like he's had some top-notch names that are, like, so yeah, go check it out. It's a real worthwhile investment in time.
What about you, Seth? Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Oh, it's a little-known website called capturingchristianity.com, where I've written a couple blog posts. I'm also on academia.edu, a vastly outdated one. But check out my writings there. There's going to be some more blog posts coming up soon enough. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for joining me. This has been an awesome discussion. There was a point during the dialogue where I was just like, this is amazing. This is so good. Like if I wasn't hosting this, a lot of times when I'm doing these discussions and I'm hosting it, I'm like, I wish I could just like stop doing the hosting job and just like sit back and listen for real. Cause I've got to be like pulling these comments in. I got to be thinking about stuff. And I wish I didn't have to do that because the dialogue was just so good. But anyways, I really appreciate both of you taking the time to come on for this discussion.
Thank you, Cam.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for hosting.
All right, and with that, we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video. That's important. But also, we have a lot of cool things going on in the background. I wish I could share with you. I will share them soon, but there's just a whole lot going on. You definitely want to make sure you subscribe so you can get the latest content and news. All right, see you guys in the next video.